I've entitled this video, Success in the UK, Slow Progress in the US. Maybe I gave the impression that 1964 was not a very successful year for the Rolling Stones in the United States. And it's a little bit unfair to keep comparing them to the Beatles all the time. It gets a little bit irritating to Rolling Stones fans who feel like, okay, they weren't as successful as the Beatles initially. I get it. But by saying slow progress in the US, I mean to paint a picture that shows that there are some major inroads. 1965 is going to be the year when the Rolling Stones really break through, and we'll talk about that in next week's videos. But for now, let's talk a little bit about how things were unfolding for their career in the UK and in the US. In the middle of 1963, the group had their first UK TV appearances on a show called Thank Your Lucky Stars, and then in August in 1963 on Ready, Steady, Go. So this is getting their image and their music out there to a television audience. They did a 30-date UK concert tour in September and October of 1963, along with the Everly Brothers, Bo Diddley, and then later in the tour, Little Richard was added to the tour. The story is that they weren't getting the crowds they needed, so they added Little Richard to really pack the joint and make the concert tour a success. So we see the Rolling Stones sort of getting onto a concert tour kind of thing, getting out of the smallish clubs and stuff that they'd been working in before around London, and getting onto television, getting onto at least the English concert scene. In January of 1964, they appear on Top of the Pops, a big show in UK television. And then they do 2 UK tours in early 1964. So they're getting around. They're now moving in a kind of more a higher professional level. It's not small blues clubs around London anymore. They're getting around the country. They're getting on TV. As we said before, Not Fade Away was released in the US in March of 1964, although, only number 48 in the charts, okay, but in the UK in February 64, when it was released, number 3 on the charts. Remember that the EP had just been number 1. Now they got a single that's number 3. They're stars in the UK in the first half of 1964. The first album is released. It's released in April of 1964, simply called The Rolling Stones. We'll take a little bit closer look at that in the next video. It goes to number 1 in the charts. So wow, things are really starting to happen in the first half of 1964 for the Rolling Stones. The EP at number 1, the first single, the Not Fade Away, that single at number 3, and the first album at number 1. In fact, that's almost the same album. It's almost the same album in the UK version and the US version. The US version is retitled England's Newest Hitmakers, the Rolling Stones, retitled by Decca's American subsidiary called London Records. They retitled it without telling Andrew Loog Oldham. He hated that title, America's Newest Hitmakers. But released in June of 1964, just as they were getting ready to tour or were touring the United States, that album went to number 11 in the United States. So you see real progress from a single that had been released in March and gone to number 48 to an album that was now at number 11. Well, that first US tour was a pretty mixed success. They toured in June of 1964. It included a TV appearance, state fairs, and a Carnegie Hall concert. Interestingly, the Carnegie Hall concert promoted by Sid Bernstein, who'd also promoted and played a big role in bringing the Beatles to New York in February of that same year, 1964. So now the Stones at Carnegie Hall. Some of the concerts go well. There's one in Southern California that goes really quite well. It's like the kind of mad scenes at the Rolling Stones shows back in the UK. But others, not so well. A couple of state fairs in Texas. There's even a story about how police were called to the hotel they were staying at because women were bathing topless in the pool, only to come out that the women in question were actually the Rolling Stones. But with their long hair, somebody thought there were women out there without their tops on. A lot of harassment, a lot of being called names. In fact, kind of being harassed on national television. There was a show called The Hollywood Palace, which was hosted by Dean Martin. Some of you may know Dean Martin as being famous for being part of Frank Sinatra's Rat Pack. He was a really, really talented song stylist starting his career in the 1950s, but his kind of stage pattern was that he acted like he was drunk, kind of inebriated most of the time with a martini glass and a tuxedo and just a little bit tipsy and saying all kinds of maybe rude things, but making smart remarks about people. Kind of a softer, slightly drunken Don Rickles. And anyway, one of his targets, or his target this particular night, was the Rolling Stones. And so the Rolling Stones are playing on national television, sort of being made fun of by Dean Martin as he's introducing them, and after they play. They didn't think too much of that. In fact, Mick said a couple things about that tour. In his more optimistic moments, he said, well, we realized we were going to have to come back and keep working on it again and again. But at the time, they basically felt like they were a little bit ripped off, like the thing had been poorly done. They were big stars in the UK, and here they were being treated like this in the US, not so good. So when they left to go back, they were kind of happy to leave that tour behind them. Although they were back in the second half of 1964, in the fall of 1964, and that went much better. They had a performance on the Ed Sullivan Show that went quite well, and they also appeared on the Tammy Show. That's the Teenage Awards Music International Show, a very famous video. If you've never seen a video of that show, it's got a lot of Supremes, Chuck Berry, James Brown does a fantastic performance, and the Rolling Stones. So the second tour in the fall of '64 was much better. One of the real redeeming things that came out of that summer tour of the U.S. is they got an opportunity to stop in Chicago and record in the Chess Studios. So in June of 1964, the Rolling Stones record a number of tracks at Chess Records. Those studios in which, in their imaginations, all of the music that they so much loved of the Chicago electric blues tradition, those Chuck Berry records, had been recorded. So that for them was a golden moment. And we're going to talk more about the recordings they made in one of our future videos this week. So stay tuned for that. So let's do that. Let's turn to the debut album and consider that in a little bit more detail. The debut album, The Rolling Stones.